The most boring novel I read in 2019 was I Wish You All the Best by Mason Diva, which kinda killed me because I was genuinely hoping to like it. And I'm not saying that the book is bad, it's easy enough to read to completion, there aren't really any glaring issues, and it's not like it deserves a protracted public beating or anything. I Wish You All the Best is just kinda emblematic of problems that I have with a lot of novels. The story is fine, the characters are fine, novels got themes and ideas out the wazoo, you'd think it'd all be great, but the real problem is that the way it's written, and I'm talking capital R written, is stale. It is plain white bread. It is like opening a bottle of scotch and finding yourself drinking water. It's bland! And look, there are a lot of components to capital R writing. You can talk about word choice, you can talk about style, you can talk about iambic pentameter if you're pretentious. But today, I want to dive into the most central component of literary storytelling. And it's one that you don't even need a thesaurus on hand to start experimenting with. It's the narrator. Now, you probably think you know some stuff about narrators. There's first-person and third-person narrators, there's omniscient and non-omniscient narrators, but what if I told you that the scope of narrators is actually very broad and incredibly expressive? I'm not going to tell you how you ought to be writing your specific narrators. To any aspiring writers watching, that's your job. However, I am going to yammer on about one particular model for narrator typology that I'm fond of, and hopefully if you listen along we can spark some creative juices, get some ideas for how you, aspiring writers, could design the narrators who helm your stories. Strap in, nerds! I'm about to school you with some undergraduate level literary theory. Don't study an arts degree, kids. The only thing you can do with it is take your newly acquired knowledge and hope to find a way to monetize it on the internet. Focalisation is a term invented by French literary theorist, critic, and rhetorician Gerard Genette, and with a resume like that, I can only assume that explaining his theories is going to be extremely clear and straightforward. Genette is perhaps best remembered in literature circles as the guy who reintroduced a bunch of terms into literary criticism. If you've ever used the word trope to describe something in fiction, then you can thank him for that one. Focalisation in literature is adjacent to perspective or point of view. Narratologists argue over the exact definition, but broadly speaking, it may be defined as a selection or restriction of narrative information in relation to the experience and knowledge of the narrator, the characters, or other more hypothetical entities in the story world. That might sound confusing. And it is, so let me try to ease you into this idea, starting with a term you're probably more familiar with. Perspective is what it says on the tin. Whose point of view is the reader being given in this story? For example, in The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller, the novel is about two principal characters, Achilles and his gay lover Patroclus. But the story is told from Patroclus's perspective. First off, it's actually his voice telling the story in first person. Second, the reader only ever sees what Patroclus sees. This means that when Patroclus and Achilles are separated, we follow Patroclus instead of Achilles. And third, when events are described in a subjective way, it's Patroclus's judgment or interpretation that is told to the reader. Patroclus gets to describe things as beautiful or awful or whatever, and that's the interpretation of scenes and events that we get, regardless of if Achilles might have interpreted the scene differently. This is what it means to be told a story from a particular character's point of view. The reader is restricted to only the information that character has access to, and is also described the tale in a way that reflects that character's tastes, values, and biases. Rather straightforward idea, but then Genette saw what was going on here and thought that placing everything that was happening under the umbrella term of perspective or point of view wasn't specific enough. We need to subdivide! And that's where focalization comes in. Focalization is one way of typing narrators based on the limitations that point of view places upon a story. If you remember the first part of the definition, focalization may be defined as a selection or restriction of narrative information in relation to the experience and knowledge of the narrator. So, the distinguishing feature between types of focalization is what information the narrator has access to in relation to the protagonist or potentially other characters as well. In the Song of Achilles, the perspective of the narrator and of the protagonist Patroclus are completely identical. The narrator has access to the same information that the protagonist has access to, including the protagonist's subjective thoughts, feelings, and biases. Usually this is because the protagonist is the narrator speaking in first person, but there are third-person narrators in this style as well. This is called internal focalization, which can be broadly defined as the narrator and the protagonist have access to the same information. Internal can be taken to mean that the point of view is from inside the protagonist's mind, and there are many writing techniques that have been developed over the centuries to try and align the internal perspective with the form of the literature, such as stream of consciousness and free association, both of which attempt to emulate the actual thought patterns of the character whose mind the reader is supposedly occupying. Usually though, this is achieved simply through writing the narration in the protagonist's own voice, which still has very strong potential for characterization. Consider The Stranger by Albert Camus. The protagonist and narrator Meursault is an absolute psychopath, and the reader comes to know this through spending the entire novel trapped inside his perspective, and reading the way that Meursault chooses to describe other people with a total lack of empathy is incredible characterization. The internal perspective also manifests itself in the fact that Meursault never learned the name of the man who he murders halfway through the novel, so the reader is never told his name either, and the fact that Meursault instead chooses to refer to the man as the Arab says more about Meursault and his racialized perspective than he would even realize. Meursault is exactly the type of protagonist who makes you want to drag him out of the pages to slap him in the face, and I love it. A far more common type of focalization, especially in science fiction and fantasy, is what's typically called the omniscient narrator, where the narrator takes ostensibly an objective God's eye perspective, where they can tell the reader basically anything. This is usually done in third person, though not necessarily. For example, The Book Thief by Markus Zusak uses a rare first-person omniscient narrator. Practically for the story, omniscience means that the narrator can describe whole scenes, giving the reader as many or as few details as the author wants, regardless of whom in the scene witnessed those details, if anyone. Terry Pratchett was very good at this, often leveraging his narrator's omniscience for the purposes of some very creative comedy that really works from an overhead vantage point on the action, especially his jokes that involve physics. When the narrator in The Light Fantastic explains to us that light on the Discworld is slow and lazy compared to light from elsewhere in the universe, there's no character giving this information to the reader. The narrator is speaking completely unfiltered from any limitations on its perspective, to the point where, in this moment, it's not clear whether this information is something that anyone on the disc is actually aware of. Omniscient narrators are referred to by Jeanette as having zero focalization. You can think of this as the narrator not being focalized, but practically speaking, what this means is that the narrator has access to more information than the protagonist or any of the individual characters in the story, such that the narrator's perspective never really lines up with any one of the characters, or even a reasonable observer of the events. The reader can still have limited information, which is why calling this type of narrator, omniscient, can trip people up sometimes, but the key component of zero focalization is that there is no limitations to what information the narrator can access. Even if the narrator doesn't tell the reader absolutely everything, there's still an understanding that the narrator could tell the reader anything. The final type of focalization is a lot rarer in literature, but it refers to when the protagonist has access to information that the narrator does not. This is called external focalization. The best way to understand it is the example that everyone uses to explain this. Think of a camera in a movie. The camera observes the protagonists from a distance. We don't hear their thoughts, and there's no narrator to describe their feelings. Or at least that's usually the case if we're talking about a good movie. Instead, the audience is left to engage with the characters through detached observation, and the acting occupies the space where internal thoughts and feelings would be in a book. Remember, the protagonist's internal thoughts and feelings are information that the narrator may or may not have access to. So if the narrator cannot access thoughts and feelings inside the protagonist's head, that's external focalization, because it's information that the protagonist has access to, but the narrator does not. The narrator's point of view is outside the protagonist's perspective, similar to omniscient narration, but access to information is still restricted by something. The narrator cannot tell us absolutely anything freely. In The Hunger Artist by Franz Kafka, the literal starving artist is the protagonist of the story, but the reader doesn't see the events through his eyes. We instead come to know the town and the artist's time in it as if we ourselves had been there and learned the story simply through being in the place. We may not take the point of view of any particular observer, but our perspective is more or less aligned with what a casual observer of the events would know through directly witnessing them. This is where the hypothetical entity part of the definition comes in, by the way. Focalization may be defined as a selection or restriction of narrative information in relation to the experience and knowledge of the narrator, the characters, or other more hypothetical entities in the story world. In this case, the artist's motivation for starving himself is something that the reader is not given access to until it is spoken by him at the end of the story. That's information we as the reader don't have access to until an observer would have learned it. Our perspective is outside the protagonist's mind, but the narrator is non-omniscient, therefore it's external focalization. So those are the three types of focalization: internal, external, and zero. But what's important to consider is that narrators don't have to stick to only one type for the entire duration of the novel. Take Flames by Robbie Arnott, which is perhaps one of the best examples of polyphony in contemporary literature. Each chapter, the narrator's perspective, identity, and voice changes. In one chapter, the narrator might be an internally focalized character narrating in first person. In another, it might be a third-person external narrator speaking in present tense. And there's a couple chapters in this novel that use epistolary format, a style of writing that emulates a series of documents, such as journal entries and letters. Most books typically use only a single narrator voice, but just keep in mind that the decision for what/who is my narrator is not necessarily something that you lock in for the entire novel. If you believe that it suits your story well, you can vary it up and switch perspectives. That's not to say that the focalization model doesn't have its limitations. For example, in Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, the narrator of the main story is Charles Marlowe, who is telling his story to a quartet of friends while hanging out in a yacht on the River Thames. Most of the story is written in first person, and Marlowe will freely tell his audience about his own subjective thoughts and feelings on certain events in his tale. However, Marlowe never fully takes over as the narrator. His account of events actually remains in quotations for the entire novel, because the narrator never actually takes on his perspective. His narration is always being quoted through direct speech by the actual narrator. Therefore, the narrator is always outside Marlowe's mind, listening to him speaking on the yacht, even though most of the story is still Marlowe's voice speaking in first person. So is this internal or external focalization? You might say that the story is internally focalized because it's told using Marlowe's voice and he freely shares his thoughts and feelings. You might also say that the story is externally focalized because the reader doesn't have full access to Marlowe's perspective in the same way as if the point of view was from inside his mind. And if you're going by the strict definitions of narrator has the same information as the protagonist versus the protagonist has information that the narrator does not, then it seems like the deciding factor is whether Marlowe is withholding relevant story information from the reader, which is not possible to know. Now, in my opinion, that's not a huge slight at all against the general applicability of the focalization model. Realistically, any model that you could come up with to try and compartmentalize the infinite possibility space that is fictional storytelling will always find exceptions eventually. Speaking of which, you might be wondering, how is talking about focalization any different from just talking about perspective? Like, what does this model give us that we wouldn't get if we just talked about what the narrator's point of view is in the story? That's a good question, and it's one that narratologists have argued about for decades. Narratologists tend to have a difficult time agreeing on the exact definitions of categories in their field! That is just listed as a fact on Wikipedia. That is hilarious. I love it so much. Jeanette originally intended for focalization to be a reformulation of already established ideas about point of view in literature. The idea was not necessarily to change how literary critics talked about point of view, but to refine the terminology to something supposedly more granular, precise, and standardized. According to Jeanette, the term point of view groups together too many components of the narrator, and the way that he distinguishes between these two components is with the questions who sees and who speaks, because the answer to both of those questions is not necessarily the same. If a story is told from the limited perspective of a single character, but the narrator is speaking in third person, that means that the information that makes up the story is seen by a different entity than the one that's speaking to us through the actual words on the page. Focalization is an analytical tool meant to deal with the question, who sees? Whose eyes are we witnessing the story through? What exactly is providing the information from which the story is constructed? So, how do we answer the question of who speaks? Diegesis is a concept with which a lot more people are probably somewhat familiar. If you've ever heard self-aggrandizing YouTube analysts talk about diegetic versus non-diegetic, then, well, you're about to learn where all that theory comes from. But first, a quick recap. Or I guess if you've never heard of this before, then this would be your primer. Diegesis simply refers to the story world of a fiction. Everything that happens in a story, the characters, the setting, the events, all of that good stuff, is what snooty academics call the diegesis. We call things that exist in the story diegetic, and things that don't exist in the story, but are otherwise still a part of the text, non-diegetic. The easiest example of this is background music in TV and movies. If the scene takes place in, say, a bar or a club where you can clearly tell that the music is coming from inside the scene, then that is diegetic audio, because it exists in the story world, or in the diegesis.
I will take a pitcher of the finest lager in the house.
You can imagine that if you were in that scene with the characters, you would still be able to hear that music. However, if you watch an action scene and there's an intense backing track blaring in the background, That is non-diegetic audio because the background music doesn't exist in the scene itself. It's never implied that the characters themselves can hear the music playing over the fight scene, and if you were inside the scene with the characters, you wouldn't be able to hear it either. The music here only exists for the audience. It's still a part of the movie, and it can still be relevant to analysis of the film. However, it doesn't exist as a part of the story, so it's outside the diegesis, which means it's non-diegetic. You can apply this idea to a lot of elements in a work of audiovisual fiction. For example, if text appears on the screen that the characters can't see and otherwise don't acknowledge, that's non-diegetic text. If you're playing a video game, it's likely that your heads-up display is non-diegetic, although some exceptions do exist. So you might be wondering, how does diegesis apply to literature? Books don't have audio or visuals, and the examples that everyone uses to illustrate diegesis are all audiovisual presentational elements. Therefore, is everything that you read in a novel diegetic? What in a novel would even be considered non-diegetic? If you've been paying attention to the general theme of this video, then you'll have already guessed that in literature you can apply this idea to the narrator. Here's an obvious example. In Turtles All the Way Down by John Green, the story is narrated by the protagonist, Aza. Aza is a character in the story. She exists in the world of the novel, so she's a diegetic narrator. Whereas in something like, say, The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, the narrator isn't a character in the story. In fact, there's no pretense in this novel for why the reader is being told anything that they are told by the novel. The narrator is third person, unfocalized, is not named, does not refer to itself at any point, and none of the characters acknowledge any kind of storyteller entity that could be said to be taking on the role of the narrator in this novel. In this case, the narrator is not a part of the diegesis. Its function is purely as a vector for telling the story to the reader. So this is what you could call a non-diegetic narrator. The narrator doesn't exist in the story world. Instead, the narrator more so functions purely as the mechanism through which the story is communicated. Now, I've used the terms diegetic and non-diegetic here just to ease you into the idea, but those are not the actual terms coined by Jeanette. Yes, narratologists in the audience, you can stop cringing now. Or can you? So according to Jeanette's terminology, a homodiegetic narrator is present in the story they tell. This would be your Aza from Turtles All the Way Down. Whereas a heterodiegetic narrator is not present in the story they tell. This would be your third-person omniscient narrator without an identity, such as the one in The Last Unicorn. Sounds awfully similar to what I just explained before, but remember, this is Jeanette we're talking about, and Jeanette loves to subcategorize. According to Jeanette, an intradiegetic narrator tells the story from inside the story, whereas an extradiegetic narrator tells the story from outside the story. That sounds similar to definitions for homo and heterodiegetic, but there is a subtle difference. If you've read Turtles All the Way Down, then you'll know at the end of the book, the narration reveals that the story is actually being told by Aza decades after the events described in the book. When the book's story is concluded, Aza remarks that after these events, she grew up, had children, sought therapy, and chose to write about her past experiences after encouragement from her therapist. This recontextualizes the novel as a retrospective exercise on the part of Aza herself, who is telling the story from the perspective of an adult recounting events from their teenage years. So, while the story is being told by a character who features in the story, hence the narrator is homodiegetic, Aza the narrator is nonetheless well outside the story she is telling as she is telling it to the reader, as in she's speaking to us in retrospect after the story has concluded. Hence, the narrator is also extradiegetic. Contrast this with a story like All Quiet on the Western Front, where Paul Boymer narrates the story in present tense as he experiences it, barring the occasional flashback where he only then uses past tense, and that's an example of a narrator that is homodiegetic and intradiegetic, because Paul is narrating from inside the story he is currently telling. You might be wondering if this distinction actually makes that much of a difference to the novels themselves. Generally speaking, across all of literature, it obviously depends on how each novel uses its specific narrator, but I'll use these two books as a basic example. Turtles All the Way Down uses its extradiegetic narrator to frame the story as a foundational event in Aza's life, and invite the reader to think about it as such. How would this event act as an important stepping stone in the broader context of the rest of Aza's life? By contrast, All Quiet on the Western Front uses its intradiegetic narrator to more completely pull the reader into the moment-to-moment of Paul's experiences of war. We are not supposed to consider his story as a chapter of his life so much as we are supposed to be viscerally immersed by the immediacy and present reality of the experiences themselves. As for The Last Unicorn, the purpose of the extradiegetic heterodiegetic narrator, as I've already stated, is simply to be a vector for the story. Now, I want to make it clear that this by itself is not a bad or uninteresting approach. I actually love The Last Unicorn a lot, and it has a lot of interesting things going on besides the narrator. To any aspiring writers watching, you don't need to try to be fancy with your narrators in order for your story to be better. Narrators are one tool in the literary toolbox. If your story requires a simple one, then go right ahead and use that. But don't be afraid to experiment with the different narrator types and see what works best for your story. So we've covered 3 out of 4 narrator subtypes so far, but what would be an example of a narrator that is both intradiegetic and heterodiegetic? Is it even possible to not be present in a story that you're narrating inside of? So I can fudge a simple explanation for this, but the more academically accepted version is a bit complicated. I'll give you the simple one first though. In Nutshell by Ian McEwan, the narrator is a third trimester fetus. Listen, this book is bizarre as hell, just go with me on this. Nutshell's unborn narrator is obviously inside the diegesis. I mean, he is literally inside one of the characters. However, he's not really a character in the story he is narrating. He can't participate in any way. Other examples could be stories narrated by objects or animals, where the focus is human characters who act out a story that the objects or animals don't participate in as characters themselves, though they are still constrained by their place inside the diegesis. These could be examples of intra-heterodiegetic narrators, although this does change the definition of heterodiegetic from is present in the story to participates in the story, which is why I described this explanation as kind of a fudge. But I still very much prefer this to the complicated answer, which requires that we talk about frame narrative. In the Arabian Nights, or 1001 Nights depending on the version, the reader is introduced to the character Scheherazade, who marries a vicious king and keeps him entertained night after night by telling him stories. Scheherazade's various tales make up the bulk of the text, and so what we have here is a collection of various stories being framed by another story of which Scheherazade is the protagonist. Jeanette, as always, has to come up with some new terms to describe this. According to him, the frame story is told at the diegetic level, while the stories narrated by Scheherazade are told at the metadiegetic level. Metadiegetic basically means that the story is being narrated by a fictional character who is themselves a character in a frame story. The reason why this is important to know is because Scheherazade is both an intradiegetic and a heterodiegetic narrator, but in this case, both of those terms refer to different levels of the diegesis. Scheherazade is intradiegetic at the diegetic level, i.e. in the frame narrative, but she is also heterodiegetic at the metadiegetic level, i.e. in the collection of stories which she herself is narrating. I'm not gonna lie, this feels like Jeanette is cheating just a bit just to fill out all the narrator subtypes. Also, it needs to be said, he just cannot get over the word diegesis. Like seriously, I've never said diegesis more times in my life. Funnily enough, Jeanette didn't invent the term. It's actually an ancient Greek word meaning story or narrative, and it's also probable that he misinterpreted the word when he was reading Book 3 of Plato's Republic, hence his frankly bizarre nomenclature. Oh yeah, I managed to get a copy of Plato's Republic before everything got locked down for COVID. Yes! Okay, so the scene is, Socrates is having a chat with Adiamantris about how Athenian youths are taught to recite the great works of the poets. This is a part of a larger argument that Socrates is making about education in general, but the whole argument is beyond the scope of this video, so don't at me. If you were a student in ancient Athens, a significant part of your education would be dedicated to memorizing and reciting the works of ancient Greek poets like Homer. Ancient Greek poetry has a theatrical style to it. It contains lines that correspond to specific characters in the tales being sung, and when the poet or the student of the poet said these lines, they were often required to perform them as the character who was speaking. So when Homer, or whoever was reciting him, is performing the Iliad, at some point, they will speak as the character Chryses. Socrates uses the Greek word mimesis to describe this, which literally translates to imitation, representation, or enactment. You can think of it as mimicry. Homer is mimicking Chryses as he is speaking Chryseis' lines in direct speech. However, Homer at other points tells the tale not by mimicking any of the characters, but by speaking as the poet, as the ultimate authority and objective eye on the events of the story being recited. Socrates points out the distinction to Adiamantris, and in the original Greek version of the text calls the poets speaking as themselves hapil diegesis, meaning plain or unmixed narrative. This is essentially what we think of today as an omniscient or objective narrator. Socrates calls the poets speaking as the characters diegesis dia mimesios, literally translating to diegesis by way of mimesis, or narrative by way of representation. In modern literature, this style is roughly analogous to first-person narration, which kinda makes a lot of sense. When John Green is writing in first person using the voices of Arza, Hazel, Quentin, and Miles, is it not accurate to say that he's imitating the characters, acting as them, mimicking them, pretending to be the characters for as long as he's putting their words on the page? Maybe the role of the writer is not so much to be an author as it is to be an actor. Perhaps acting in a less literal sense than an actor that you see on stage or in a film, but it could still be considered a form of acting nonetheless. Even if the storyteller isn't writing in the voice of their protagonist, they are still taking on the form of some dramatic role within or just outside the diegesis, whether that be the objective eye of the omniscient deity who sees everything, the limited perspective of a hypothetical eyewitness, or whomever it was that wrote the epistolic documents that form the narrative. If you're an aspiring writer, the first thing you're going to be thinking of while writing is what your story is, the characters, the setting, the plot, and so on. But also try to think about who or what is telling your story, what that person or entity's perspective is, and how they would tell the story because of it. These days, the definition of diegesis has shifted to be more about distinguishing what elements of a text are part of the story and what parts are purely presentational elements for the audience. But it does pay to trace the origin of the term because it prompts the question of how exactly is the audience supposed to be accessing the information contained within the story? Is a character telling them the story? Or is there a holistic view being given to them by, say, a deity-like author who controls every aspect of the fiction? Are they being given the story by an incomplete and potentially biased set of documents? Are they supposed to be literally occupying the mind of either the protagonist or an eyewitness? Another way you might ponder this is by asking, who speaks? Most modern media doesn't really bother answering this question, especially when it comes to film. Most TV and movies adopt an objective, non-diegetic camera that doesn't actually exist in the story world, barring exceptions like Rec, The Blair Witch Project, and the rest of the found footage genre. Also fictional mockumentaries like The Office or What We Do in the Shadows. Contemporary literature— oh, there's also Hardcore Henry, a movie which prompts the question, Why am I not just playing Doom instead? Contemporary literature has taken a lot of influence from audiovisual media, and admittedly, a lot of recent novels have kinda devolved into just being either an extra heterodiegetic third-person omniscient narrator, or an internally focalized intra-homodiegetic first-person narrator. What's my source for that claim? Go to the bookstore and pick a random book off the sections for science fiction, fantasy, YA, mystery, or romance. Look, those types of narrators aren't, intrinsically bad. I just wish that more authors would use those narrators with deliberation and purpose, rather than not considering the narrator at all beyond simply being the thing that tells the story. My favorite books are, and continue to be, novels which can find ways to leverage their specific narrators as part of the style, themes, or characterization. In my opinion, the literary narrator might be one of the most versatile storytelling mechanisms out there when it comes to exploring different perspectives. Why do I think this? As a reader and a book reviewer, I will say that considering focalization and diegesis as concepts, and trying to examine narrators through this lens, has led to me being just generally more conscious of how the narrator factors into my enjoyment of a text. That's not necessarily a praise of Genette's model specifically, as you could theoretically make that argument for any model that seeks to subcategorize narrators. Keep in mind that Genette's model isn't the only typology of narrators that exist in narratology. That being said, I do think that I've demonstrated that Genette's model does have applicability, at least at the non-academic level, through being able to cite examples of various narrator subtypes and making statements about them. These days, with dozens of different artistic mediums, from film to theatre to video games and so on, some art critics like to talk about and compare the strengths and weaknesses of the various mediums when it comes to artistic storytelling. And I want to make a case for what I think is one of literature's strongest advantages as an artistic medium. The fundamental difference between reading and seeing information visually, like in a film, is that when you read, you have to render the information contained within a text inside your own mind. Visual and sound information tends to go straight to your brain, whereas written information has to be, well, read. You have to reconstruct the scene in your mind by decoding it from the language on the page. Whether you do this visually, or you imagine the sound of the narrator's voice, or whatever it is that you do, this gives literature access to your mind's inner mechanisms in a way that audiovisual media tends to struggle with. I've explored this idea before in my review of The Giddy Death of the Gays and the Strange Demise of Straits by Redfern John Barrett. The novel used this feature of the medium to an outstanding effect with the narrator's use of neopronouns, which was an absolutely bold writing decision that I hadn't experienced before. What it means for the novel is that readers have to be able to read fluidly with the neopronouns in order for the story to be passed, and it effectively places a degendered perspective on the world into the reader's mind. The reader actually gets to occupy the mindset of a character who doesn't see gender, a feat that may have additional obstacles if it were to be done in an audiovisual medium. Playing with the narrator in this way and commanding the reader's psychological perspective is something that I very much love in novels, and it's also something that I don't see as successfully in movies, video games, or other audiovisual media. The reason why I chose to speak about Genette and the ideas of focalization and diegesis is not because I think it's a perfect model for how to describe all narrators in literature, but because I believe that narrators are so much more diverse and broad than most writers usually think. It kills me that most people only know narrators as either first person, third person, omniscient, or limited. My favourite novels tend to be the ones that play around with perspective, writing style, literary form, narrative voice, and other aspects of narrators, because they can take what would be a straightforward story and spin it into something that's absolutely fantastic to read. I'm talking about the vibrant and chaotic polyphonic narration of Robbie Arnott's Flames, the cheeky and fiction-shattering annotated manuscript of Confessions of the Fox by Jordi Rosenberg, the free and playful form of Max Porter in his two novels, and the multi-perspective, multi-formed LGBT romp that is Crimson by Niviaq Corneliusen. I love unorthodox narrators. I love weird narrators. These kinds of books are why I love reading literature, and they make me fascinated by all the various components of narrators and how their perspective could be played with. I also just have to recommend some old classics. Dracula by Bram Stoker is essential for anyone interested in epistolary format. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley has some very good stuff going on with frame narrative. Chronicle of a Death Foretold by Gabriel Garcia Marquez commands and combines multiple biased perspectives like no other. And Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin is a masterful example of characterization through narration. Also, you know what? I recommend reading I Wish You All the Best by Mason Deaver. I know I slagged that novel at the beginning, but you know what? It's a fine read. My tastes are snobbish as hell. Don't believe anything I say. Read the book. I hope you enjoy it, and if you do, I will be happy for you that you enjoy it, and I only wish that I could have enjoyed it too. Check it out. Mason Deaver, I hope that there's no hard feelings between us. Oh dear. If you're an aspiring writer, I want to be able to share my excitement for narrators with you, partly because I'm just a huge nerd who wants to share my passion, but I also selfishly want more books that play with the narrator and experiment with different perspectives. The narrator isn't your canvas, it's your palette. So make your palette colourful. Also, I've mentioned a few books in this video as examples of things. I recommend all of them. Any book that I've mentioned in this video, just take it as a big list of book recommendations. Go and read some books and support your local independent bookstores if possible. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching.